There we go. Hi, my name's AK. You can reach me at peaches@usermind.com. This is just a talk. Please do not laugh. I'm ridiculous.
Anybody wants a story about Peaches, I'll tell you after the talk.
So Colin's back there, and that's Chris. If you need to talk to any of us, you're welcome to shoot us an email. So this talk is about EmberJS and Angular, our switch from Angular to Ember. So what had happened was when I first joined UserMind, we had a small repo on Angular, so I started working on that project. My background is in Backbone, and jQuery, of course. And so the thing with Angular is that when you first work on it, it was very easy to get things done. Very minimal. You have HTML, you have a controller, and then there's this concept of a scope, and we'll talk more in that a little bit, that you modify and it magically appears on the page. So the problem that I felt with Angular was that there was not that much structure, right? Coming from Backbone, there's some structure in Backbone, right? Backbone gives you sort of like the baseline, so you can build your own structure. There's objects, there's models, views that you can inherit from. But when you look through Angular code, you actually don't see a lot of that. You search for inheritance, right? Class inheritance for Angular. They go, oh, you could do scope inheritance. First time I'm in there, I'm like, what the fuck is scope inheritance? I don't know, right? And then, of course, you go into scope and directives, and you're like, what the fuck is all this shit, right? So for me, it was. I wish I could grow something like that, but I can't. So when you first, in terms of scope, it's actually very confusing. Let's see. So this is JS Fiddle, as you guys know. So when you like I said earlier, this is very simple. There's some more background, but essentially this is your main Angular app. So given this name here, you could specify the controller with the name there, and it will run that controller. It will assign the name to that, and so you get superhero there.
Are you able to make it any bigger?
Probably can. Do you want it to be bigger?
Sure.
There we go.
Yeah, perfect.
So the issue is sometimes later in your code, right? Let's say you have an AJAX call. That all of this is actually being ran. My controller right here is being ran in an Angular digest. So what happens is anything that happens inside this digest, it sort of knows about its content and it updates the web page. So, but then when you're out of the digest, for example, if I have a function, I can't type. So if I have a function that changes the name, right? And I actually run this outside of the context of, let's see, do console.log. So if I run this outside of Angular, let's say from the event loop, right? You do the set timeout, you put your call back inside of an event loop. Actually, it would be change name. So when you run this, you expect, okay, you're modifying the scope. That as you see when the console prints out change name, let me see if I could increase that as well. There we go. When the console prints out change name, that you'd expect, because you modified the name of the scope here, that you'd see superhero change to UserMind, but it doesn't. And so then you gotta, you start looking around, you go, what the hell? I'm modifying my scope and it doesn't work. You go, maybe it needs to run in like this context, right? So you put in bind this, you run it again, change name again, but it doesn't. So then you look around Google. So then there's this concept of actually a scope apply. And you go, oh wow, that's really neat. So inside of your function, because you have access to the scope, you actually have to call this thing called apply so that the scope knows that it's being modified. So one more layer of functions here. and you run it, hopefully this time, it works, right? So you successfully change the username, the name to something else. But once I started working with this, like it became apparent that there's this idea of something being ran inside of Angular and something that's being ran in JavaScript outside of Angular. So there are two worlds that you have to keep track of. So any time that you have your code running, you have to go, oh, am I in Angular or am I not? So in this case, if we actually are not in Angular, if we are in Angular and we call the same function, we actually get an error because we are in the digest and an apply is being called. And you call an apply again and it goes, dude, you can't do that. You're not allowed to, right? So it errors out and it doesn't work. So to me, that itself was very confusing. Yeah, the scope, the idea of a scope was very confusing. And so I approached our CTO. I'm like, dude, this shit's confusing. We got to change it, right? And so, how do you get back? This is good enough. So that was when we started talking, looking into other things. We looked into EmberJS. And one of the cool things about, as I sort of pair them here, right? The good thing about EmberJS is you have a lot of structure. You have classes, you have inheritance, you have routes, you have views, you have all of these things. But the con to that is there's a lot of ramp-up cost. You actually have to know all these conventions. And then the con is it's relatively new. But as you can see, you see online, there's a huge community, which we like, right? Anything with a large community, you can get a lot of support. Especially there's like a forum, a Quora, Discuss or something, right? It's really useful. And then the other thing is performance. Like, and I'll go to performance later. For example, a sample Angular, EmberJS app, right? You have all these templates, and there's this here, right? You look at this and you go, oh, this is a view-ish, and this is a route. This is just HTML, and then somehow all this gets shoved onto the document. And you're going, where's the controller? Right? Like, there are all of these things that just gets created for you automatically. And so without understanding where all that is coming from, it actually becomes somewhat confusing, right? So there comes with a lot of structure. It's also a lot of confusion. So the ramp-up cost in a startup, right? We have 3 people. That was one of our fears, is how easy is it to ramp up. And so, for example, here, if you want to modify something like this, right, you'd want to be inside of some sort of you'd have to know that it's called an index controller. And you need to inherit from an object controller. Then inside of your init function, right, you'd have to have some sort of a change name inside your init function. There are ways that you could modify it, but in this case, let's just do this, actually. So same thing as before. So inside of set timeout, this is right. You could be running outside the context of Ember, but as long as you have access to the model, you can still change it. And in this case, we actually want this to be. So in here, right, once again, I certainly find that this is actually somewhat easier to think about, because actually, one more thing. Actually, no, I think this works. So I find this, even though there's a lot of structure, but when you look at the code, you could say, hey, you know what? That's very easy to reason about, because, for example, change name is ran inside the context of the controller, and I want to set the model name actually to usermine, right? So when you run that, hopefully, I didn't screw up anything. It changes from Chris, what it was before, to usermine. So for this, like I certainly felt like we felt as a team that with all the structure in place, it was a lot easier to reason about how your model, how the data from the back end flows back out to the client side. So, and then the last thing is actually performance. So most of you guys are probably familiar with this view, where Jeremy of Backbone, he wrote this thing that shows the performance between Backbone and Ember. And right here, the script is actually animating 100 of these circles. And when you do it with Ember, you can see a huge difference in performance. So that was one of the things that we worried about, right? Performance. Like, how is this thing going to affect us? But we talked about it. If you guys, I'm not sure if you guys have heard this concept of the powers of 10. So anything that's below like about 0.1 second, when a user interacts with your website, and the reaction time is less than 0.1 of a second, they think that they've modified that, right? They caused something to happen. If it's between 0.1 second to 1 second, they click on something, roughly a second later, it responds. They go, oh, you know what? I did something, the computer's thinking about it, it's responding to me. But then anything from 0.1 second to 1 second, and then to 10 seconds, the moment you get to the 10-second mark, the user clicks on something, they're sitting there, and they go, oh, something's happening. And then they lose their flow. They lose track of things, right? So that's why a lot of people, if your web page doesn't load in 2-3 seconds, right, 5 seconds, they push back because they've lost context. They don't know what they're doing anymore. And so if you take that into account, you look at this. This is 100 circles. It probably is, animating 100 circles, probably 6 times, 7 times a second. That means it's 1/600th of a second for each one of these animations, right? If you change this to 1, and you look at just Ember, that is super fast. Anytime that you do an animation, right, on the client side, user interaction, is going to be 1 thing, 2 things, maybe 10 things, right? But it's not going to be 100 things. In that case, you're writing a game. You should not be using Ember if you're writing a game, right? So in terms of performance, it's perfectly valid to use EmberJS, even though in the case of animating 100 circles, it's slow. Majority of the time, you're not going to be doing that, right? So for us, it felt like the performance hit that we take, that we're getting, is actually not that bad. The majority of the time, we're actually going to be waiting for that network hop anyway. So we could do things on the client side, but ultimately, at the end of the day, it's waiting for the network, right? It doesn't really matter. So that was essentially the things that we looked into to change from what we did in Angular over to EmberJS. Any questions?
What does 10 look like if you do 10 instead of 100? What's the difference there?
Still super fast. Way less than 0.1 a second, right?
What about with Backbone?
Super fast. You can barely tell the difference.
Wow.
Backbone's faster, yeah?
Yes,
Yeah.
still is. Josh?
You didn't really mention like why you chose that over Backbone. Like I know this is a problem.
Right. So yes.
Is there some?
Yes. So one of the reasons with Backbone that, in my experience is Backbone is very light. What ends up happening when you write a Backbone app is you go, oh, I'm missing this functionality. You hack it on. Oh, I'm missing that functionality. You hack it on, right? The problem is the majority of us, we're not framework developers. So any solution that we come up with is going to be terrible. And so it works for the moment, right? It works for the moment. But then, another developer comes in and he says, so who's the idiot that wrote this? And I'm like, oh, yeah, me, right? Like, you end up never solve the problem at the framework level. And so because, on a daily basis, you're delivering a product, you're not delivering a framework. You know, if I'm hired to do framework, right, I think about things differently. I think about things long term. I think about things in terms of generalizing. But for the most part, when you're doing an app, when you're writing an app, you're doing something to get an end result. And that something is always a trade-off, right? Whereas in a framework developer, for most framework developers, they go, oh, you know, the trade-off is about functionality and not about in terms of time. So yes, so that was the main reason why we didn't choose go with anything lighter, because you know for a fact that you're going to end up implementing a lot of these functionalities, and you're not going to do it as well as some of these guys are.
So how long did you use Angular for, and now how long have you used Ember for?
Yeah, good question. Being in a startup environment, we actually wanted to be quick about it. So the time that I was spending in Angular was probably about 2.5 weeks. And at that moment, you know, when we start to get into directives in Angular, it becomes very confusing, because when you start writing directives, I believe, is when you actually have to start using the scopes and the applies a lot more, and to be able to swap back and forth between the Angular world and the JavaScript world, like the normal event handling world. And I felt like that itself is, so with Angular, the cost at the beginning is very low, but as it goes over time, that cost is actually building up, because then as you dig deeper into Angular, doing more advanced user interface, interactions, that is going to cost more than what you're going to gain in the first week or two with Angular.
I just wanted to note that in Angular, you can wrap that in a timeout.
Correct, yes. So
it makes that other problem you're talking about disappear. But,
correct.
Yeah.
So what he's saying is, in Angular, what you could do is, instead of doing this, and that, and that, you have this thing, this magical timeout, that it gets injected into your code. So when you do this, there's this magical dependency injection that Angular does for you. And so you could do the same thing as set timeout. So here, it'd be change name. So that, what you have there is this injected $timeout. And what the $timeout is once again, is this wrapper over the top of the Angular world, right? For me, it's like this Angular view. So you end up having all of these things, right? You have $timeout, $document to represent window.document, right? You have $HTTP for HX resources. So all of these things, you have to know what they're called. And then there are different ways, actually. Oh, there we go. So you actually have to know, like, all of these things you have to research, you have to look for this up. When a lot of times, dude, I only want to know, I only want access to the document, right? Or the set timeout. So for me, like, that itself is also an additional cost that you have to know. Other questions?
Did you find like any problems with the obtrusiveness of the directives, like directly in the HTML versus with Ember when you're just pretty much dealing with templates?
Right. So I didn't actually dig much into directives. That was the point where I'm going, oh, crap. I don't want to deal with this, right? The other thing that, now that you brought that up, the other thing about Ember, not Ember, but Angular, is that HTML is like this bastardized version of HTML, right? Where the flow itself is part of the HTML tags, or these things, right? I don't know what they're called, elements, tags, something like that. So when you get into like very complicated Ember loops or Angular loops, all of these things are, you have to do something like the loop constructs inside of the element itself. And so the structure, the loop structure, for me, logically, I always think of them as separate from that of the HTML itself. But the way that Angular does it, they are integrated, they are one. And so that sometimes is very confusing, and it makes HTML look ugly, even though HTML is already ugly. Any others?
Cool.
Cheers.
All right.
Sweet.
Thanks.